Hello, my name is Brandon Hinton. I'm going to talk about LMZ3, which is complete macular pigment replenishment, and complete meaning there are three, so it takes all three, and that is lutein, mesozeaxanthine, and zeaxanthine. And really the simplistic form of this is we're going to talk about reducing risk and bettering eyesight. And so why focus on macular pigment? For starters, what we just said. We'll look at the medical legal implications of macular pigment versus AREDS and how macular pigment reduces risk for AMD, low macular pigment as a major risk factor, since that does come up as a question, and macular pigment spatial profile and the central dip or atypical spatial profile and what that means, and why meso-Z in relation to that critical central dip and atypical spatial profile, why meso-Z is a critical carotenoid. Side effects actually equal additional benefits of macular carotenoids, and then visual performance enhancement, and then also who should be taking macular pigments and how to advise and prescribe macular pigment replenishment. So first, the medical legal implications of using macular pigments versus AREDS. And a lot of times I get questions from practitioners along the lines of, well, I understand the science and I can see how this will be better for my patients, for more patients, but what is my liability legally doing this versus not doing, let's say, what I've been told is the standard of care, and that's AREDS. And the answer is actually going to surprise you. It might be the opposite of what you would think. So we'll cover that because these guys are hovering as we speak based on the new research that's come out about antioxidants and zinc combined. So just a quick joke, a little bit of jest before things get very serious. But things that mom told us to stop doing, or you're going to go blind. So sitting too close to the TV, no. Watching TV in the dark, no. Things to excess, how to change that, no. But what if one of those things that was actually causing some blindness was something we've been told is always going to reduce risk? So we're going to get into an AREDS update and how the standard of care as it has existed is now in question. And so this new study in ophthalmology, the journal, the AAO, is looking at genetic variations of individuals and how that affects the outcome of treatment with antioxidants and zinc, or the AREDS formulation as it exists today on the shelf. So you're going to want a full copy of this study. You're going to need a full copy of this study, most likely, especially for patients that you do go ahead and do genetic testing, to have the matrix to tell you what's going to be advised, whether that be AREDS in its current form or something other than the AREDS or nothing at all. And so please contact me for a full copy. I'll be happy to forward this along to you. Very important going forward. So what they were looking at was interactions, and by definition here, interactions are negative. These are bad things that happen between the nutritional supplement that patients were taking in AREDS and the treatment group. So just backing up real quick to the first AREDS study, report number 8 was the bulk of the data that came out. This new study looked at only category 3 and category 4, so large bilateral drusen or worse. And the reason to look at just that group was the original AREDS study actually said AREDS to date demonstrates no benefit of the study formulations for persons in category 1 or 2. Analysis to date do not show that treatment is effective in slowing progression of AMD from category 2 to category 3 or 4. So in effect, it didn't work for the people in the earlier stages. They progressed anyways, and in fact, some critiques of the raw data, they got the manuscripts and they analyzed the data, and they said, in fact, there is some groups of people that showed increased progression of disease, and so that's something important to think about as well. And as we go forward and look at what this new study is showing us, that will probably become pretty clear why. So we analyzed basically 1,000 patients, N of 995 individuals, white individuals in category 3 in one eye, so that could be category 4 in the other, in the fellow eye, and looking at the progression rate to advanced AMD as analyzed by genotype variation and AREDS treatment group. So whether that was placebo group, antioxidants alone, zinc alone, or antioxidants and zinc combined. So if you're thinking for a moment, well, okay, how does this apply? The AREDS 2 study is already out, and that tells us, something different. What we're talking about here is nothing to do with beta carotene. This is everything to do with combining the antioxidants and the zinc together. So zinc negated the benefits of antioxidants. Treatment with zinc and antioxidants associated with a risk ratio, anything over 1 here is bad, a risk ratio of 1.3 with 2 complement factor risk alleles. So treatment with antioxidants was associated with a relative risk of 2.58 for those with 1 ARMS 2 risk allele. If they had the 2 risk alleles, it was actually 396 for those with 2 alleles. So that's very, very bad. And treatment with zinc was associated with increased progression to AMD. So here's the matrix of the 9 different possibilities or combinations of genetic risk factors that individuals could have for their complement factor H and their ARMS 2 age-related maculopathy sensitivity to, risk. And so here's 0 and 0 and 2 and 2. So of these 9, there's actually one group that works for the formulation that is on the shelf today. And so here's the breakdown in table form. And so 1 complement factor H and 1 ARMS 2 risk allele. The best formulation is for them antioxidants and zinc, and that is 22.6% of patients with category 3 or 4 AMD. So keep in mind, you're treating the whole spectrum of patients with the disease, and in the optometric community, seeing even more in the earlier stages, category 1, category 2, where we saw very little effectiveness, if any, in the AREDS trial, which is incidentally why AREDS 2 only studied large bilateral drusen or worse. But let's say you have 1,000 AMD patients across the spectrum lined up, and we say, okay, so we're going to help 22.6% of them. Is that 226 patients? No, it's actually going to be 34 roughly. And how we arrive at that is out of all AMD patients, only about 10 to 20%, so we'll say 15% of patients are going to be in that intermediate to advanced dry AMD category 3 and 4, 22.6% of them, of that 1,000, that's 34 patients. Okay. So moving on, you actually have 19% that the AREDS formulation is actually going to outright hurt them. It's going to progress the disease worse than doing nothing at all, the placebo essentially. For 13%, the AREDS formulation performs as poorly as the placebo. I just want to back up and show one other thing. So look at the difference in the spread. For those that are outright hurt by the formulation, here's the gap between best formula and worst formula, including zinc up at the very top here, maximum progression. And the slide before that is where AREDS actually helped. And that is, that's a fairly narrow gap when you bump ahead to who's actually hurt. So the difference in the formulas is massive. So we definitely need to keep that in mind as we're advising prescribing formulations for patients. So skipping ahead here. So 29%, this study finds that there's actually no best formulation, that they should be taking nothing as far as AREDS is concerned, but don't fret yet. So of the 9 possible genetic combinations, you take away where AREDS does work for that 23%, and you're left with 77% that would be better off with something else or nothing at all as far as AREDS is concerned. So either just antioxidants, zinc alone, or nothing at all. But this doesn't refer to macular pigments. Macular pigments actually step outside of this risk. So you might be thinking, well, that's some pretty new information. It's going to take at least 5 years to corroborate these results and get to some clarity on what we're going to do. So we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Well, good for you, because that's what scientists and science-minded people in this field should be thinking, is that we need more evidence. We need to repeat studies, and that's the beauty of the peer-reviewed system. So this one pops up again, but not today. This is 2008, complement factor H and ARMS2 genotypes and treatment with antioxidants and zinc for age-related macular degeneration. And this is Klein and others at the MacDegen Research Center, KCI Institute, Oregon. They've done a lion's share of the genetic research on AMD. Now that's a little bit of an ambiguous title there, but it's telling us something, and skipping ahead to what we see today is, well, saying it with conviction, that there are definite predictive responses based on the genetics. So I want to see that. But they looked at 876 AREDS participants that were considered high risk, and that's basically categories 3 and 4, and looking for interactions. So main outcome measures, looking for interactions between genetic variants and treatment response. And what they saw was an interaction in 2008 between the complement factor H genotype and supplementation with antioxidants and zinc. So there was something definitely there with a p-value of statistical significance 0.004. That's very, very strong. And so conclusion was, yes, there's something going on here. This is a problem, but we need further corroboration of these analyses before considering changing our approach to managing later stage dry AMD. So skip ahead a year, published in IOVS, another well-respected journal in our field. And we have Joanna Seddon, really a pioneer in macular degeneration research. And this was a study looking at many different genetic factors and environmental factors as well. Nature and nurture, of course, this disease is. And they did see, in fact, a interaction between the complement factor H and treatment group after controlling for all genotypes. And this was just outside of statistical significance, yet was the second study. They weren't looking for this information. This happened to come up, and definitely makes us look twice at Klein's study from 2008. So fast forward ahead, we have the third piece of research that is essentially showing us the same thing. So what does it all mean? Well, since we're filming today in Las Vegas from Vision Expo West 2013, that a little bit of a joke, but what it means is the scattershot approach of AREDS without first doing a genetic test is basically a gamble with your patient's vision. That it has a 1 in 5 chance of helping that individual, has a 1 in 5 chance of hurting them, worse than if you did nothing whatsoever, and the other 3 is basically moot, and you could be doing something better for that individual. And so it's just not worth it to continue with the same approach that we've been doing for so long now. And so all these types of products that the patient can find on the aisle of confusion is just not going to be a good idea without doing some sort of genetic testing first. But, and I've crossed off the future applications, this is a now application, even though this is a brand new piece written by Joanna Seddon, a macular degeneration expert, that says at this point, recommending genetic testing may be best for members of high-risk families. So mother, brother, father had AMD. These individuals are concerned, rightfully, and they should probably get a genetic test done. But you're going to find a lot of patients don't want to get genetic tests done. Some people don't want to know. Some people, once they do find out about their genetics, they've done the 23andMe test or other genetic tests, they go and want to start hacking off body parts. So there's going to be people that don't want to know, they don't want to spend the money. So what do we do for those individuals? I still wouldn't advise just going out to the aisle of confusion, picking up AREDS. So macular pigment actually is going to reduce the risk no matter what, steps outside of all the genetic fray, if you will. And what she said, Joanna said in this study, was lutein, and hence macular pigment in general, to include zeaxanthine and the third component, mesozeaxanthine, is going to be protective and independent of the gene effects in this study. And so stepping outside, like I said, of that fray, all of the problems caused by the genetic variants. For those that do not want to have a genetic test done or don't want to spend for the genetic test, you have an option to treat this individual and definitely reduce their risk, and that's with macular pigments. So what is the evidence? Well, Joanna Seddon today saying that back in '94, she was probably one of the reasons that the AREDS study went ahead looking at antioxidative strategy, was the eye disease case control study and out of the Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary in Boston. And what they saw was those with the highest dietary intakes of carotenoids, because there wasn't a pill form available. You couldn't go to the drugstore anywhere and get lutein or zeaxanthin or even Meso-Z especially at that time. But those taking the highest amounts of carotenoids had a 43% risk reduction, and again, a p-value there with lutein and zeaxanthin most strongly associated with that reduced risk, 0.001. Very, very strong statistical evidence. And so then skip ahead to 2007, if the AREDS studies are more your thing and you will go all in on AREDS, then report number 22 was a follow-up to the report number 8 that we mentioned earlier about the differences between categories. But they were looking at those with the highest dietary intakes of lutein and zeaxanthin. Well, the reason that first study didn't include lutein and zeaxanthin, there was no commercially available formula. So they had to look at strictly dietary intake. But what they said was those with the highest dietary intakes of lutein and zeaxanthin, that was inversely associated with neovascular, geographic atrophy, or large and extensive intermediate drusen, so later stage dry AMD, category 3 and 4, inversely associated with intake, with an odds ratio of 0.73, which is very nice risk reduction. And that lutein zeaxanthin independently associated with decreased likelihood of these bad things happening, and the other nutrients were not independently related to AMD. So in and of themselves, macular pigments are going to be the way forward for all patients, no matter their genetic risks. So 2002, the Blue Mountains Eye Study, we'll look at the 10-year follow-up. This is at the 5-year point, but just something interesting to note, that increasing baseline intakes of vitamin C from diet or supplements was associated with increased risk of incident early AMD. So these are people that started the study with no AMD, and they actually saw progression to AMD faster in groups that had the highest intakes of the antioxidant vitamin C. And that was in the 4th and 5th quintiles with odds ratios of 1.7 and 2.3, quite high. And so at the 10-year follow-up for the Blue Mountains Eye Study, which is now at the 15-year point in the Beaver Dam study, the 20-year point, these are some of the longest running studies on patients, following them very long periods of time, looking at all of their nature and nurture factors. But lutein zeaxanthin, the top tertile of intake, reduced risk of incident neovascular AMD with a relative risk of 0.35, which is absolutely incredible. Above median intakes had reduced risk of indistinct soft drusen, the stuff that you'll only see with an OCT. The beta carotene was predictive of neovascular AMD with a relative risk of 2.68, so that would confirm the results that we've gotten from AREDS 2, and we know that it's also bad for the smokers, but this was aside from smokers. And that vitamin E was also predicting late AMD with a relative risk compared to the lowest tertile of intake of vitamin E of 2.83. So C and E, even on their own, showing another very large participant studies, large ends, long-term, that antioxidants are not the answer alone either for everyone. But the conclusion was lutein zeaxanthin was the way to go. So looking at AREDS 2, this is a good way to analyze some results as well, is 10% lower risk to advanced AMD, and this is above and beyond the AREDS 1 formulation that everybody was supposed to be taking in this study. But when you looked at just that treatment group, the 10% lower risk was actually insignificant statistically. So in the secondary analysis, So do keep in mind that, that these people were already being supplemented for a long time. They've been on supplements. They were taking the supplement, the original AREDS supplement, whether with or without beta-carotene, as a placebo. So also remember this study that only one group of the 9 possible combinations is going to benefit maximally from the AREDS formulation with antioxidants and zinc, and everyone was taking antioxidants zinc. We may have had a monkey wrench thrown in some of our results here, something working against the beneficial effects of lutein and Z. But in the secondary analysis, which combined all combination groups that were taking any lutein and zeaxanthin, we actually saw an additional 9% risk reduction that now becomes statistically significant. And we'll thank Professor John Nolan for his analysis that I am presenting here. So the evidence is even stronger when dietary intake of patients is included. So there we actually see a 20% lower risk for those that have the lowest intakes dietary for lutein and zeaxanthin. So people with the beer and pizza diet, they are benefiting the most from lutein and zeaxanthin in the AREDS formulation. So, but keep in mind, in these results, we probably had the monkey wrench thrown in there with the genetic factors that weren't even considered in the AREDS 2 study. And so that 26%, that 9% probably could be much, much greater if we were to account for all of the individuals that had the different combinations of genetics that were confounding the results for AREDS 1 and 2. So low macular pigment density, is this a major risk factor? Because I get the skeptical looks when I talk about this in a lot of cases, and they say, well, we know there's age, we know there's family history, we know that smoking, but really, is macular pigment density actually a major risk factor for AMD? Well, hold on to your seats. So reduced levels of macular pigment seem to be associated with development of AMD. This is 2008 high quality journal. But this brings up a question. Which came first? Was it the low macular pigment density, or was it the disease that caused the low macular pigment density? That's a good question. I've had that come up numerous times. So this is the old question of the chicken and egg. Which did come first? Well, fortunately, we've had that answered by Professors Bone and Landrum, and we'll revisit some of their earliest work in the field of macular pigments. But a donor study of eyes with and without AMD, basically what they were looking for to determine was the association between macular pigment density and risk of AMD. So we sectioned eyes, donor eyes, with and without, 50 donors, 56 donors, 56 controls, and cut 3 concentric rings about the fovea, and analyzed the reduction in macular pigment for those that had AMD and juxtaposed to those that didn't. And the LNZ levels were less for the AMD donors, of course, and the differences decreased in magnitude the farther we got into the periphery. So those in the highest quartile of LNZ intake had 82% lower risk for AMD compared with those in the lowest quartile of macular pigment. And so an odds ratio of 0.18, that's the strongest we've seen yet. And another interesting component to this study, and this is where it answers the question of the chicken and the egg, is these results consistent with a theoretical model that proposes an inverse association between risk of AMD and amounts of lutein zeaxanthin macular pigment in the retina, and that the results are inconsistent with a model that attributes the loss of the lutein and zeaxanthin to the destructive effects of the disease. In effect, the low macular pigment is preceding the onset of disease. So the Handbook of Nutrition and Ophthalmology, this is actually an interesting piece to come across, because this is the first time I've seen low carotenoid status marked as a risk factor for AMD outside of the academic papers published in journals. And interestingly, in 2000, Dr. Stephen Beatty, the ophthalmologist in Ireland, said many putative risk factors are actually linked to a lack of macular pigment. So every one of these major risk factors that we're currently aware of links independently to low macular pigment. So here we go. So ethnic differences in macular pigment. So looking at white non-Hispanics and Africans, we see a colossal difference in macular pigment density. So for whites, we see an average of about 0.36, and those with the darkest pigments, we see a 0.59. Now, something to keep in mind here is the scale, and this is a logarithmic scale, so these differences are exponential differences. These are huge differences in the amount of macular pigment that's in the retina. So this is actually what a spatial profile looks like, but we'll revisit this shortly. So moving on, sex differences. So we have been told that females are at more risk for macular degeneration. Well, males had 38% higher macular pigment density than females, with a p-value of 0.001. Very strong statistical evidence in support of that being a real value. How about iris colors? So taking three groups with the various iris colors from the lightest to the darkest, we see in group 1 with the very light blue eyes, we see macular pigment density of 0.25, 0.32 in the hazel and greens, and 0.38 in group 3 with the darkest brown irises. So another large difference independently related to just iris colors, nothing to do with macular degeneration specifically, but has an independent connection to a risk factor that we think of for AMD. This is a very real result. And then smoking. So past studies have shown that cigarette smoking, of course, lowers carotenoid concentrations in the blood, oxidative stress in the system. So this is the first report of cigarette smoking. This was in Vision Research in 1996, and we saw that macular pigment density and smoking frequency were inversely related in a dose-response fashion. And so the more cigarettes smoked, the lower the pigment density. And the inversely related, so here's your correlational line here, negative 0.498. That's very, very strong correlation. And so the idea is that macular pigment protects the macula from actinic damage from blue light, and passively by screening short wavelengths and actively as an antioxidant. And those smokers with more oxidative stress on their system have lower macular pigment density, hence at higher risk for developing the worst forms of macular degeneration. And then also adiposity, so those with more body fat having low macular pigment, so significant inverse relationship between percentage of body fat and macular pigment density in males. And so what was interesting in these studies was males with more lipid intake had higher macular pigment density as the lipids are carriers for the carotenoids, lipid-soluble carotenoids. The opposite for females, but nonetheless, a relative lack of macular pigment associated with body fat. So moving on to a study that looked at age, smoking, and family history by Professor John Nolan and his team at the Macular Pigment Research Group in Waterford Island. So with a combination of these factors, age, smoking, family history, increases in all of these possibilities, we see a definite reduction in macular pigment density. And so John Nolan's saying that the enhanced risk that these variables represent for age-related maculopathy may be attributable, at least in part, to a parallel deficiency of macular carotenoids. So looking at the macular pigment spatial profile, because we've been talking about low macular pigment in general, but it actually comes in a very unique form. And that's the idea of the central dip or the atypical spatial profile. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail and the importance of a very specific version of low macular pigment, because we only looked at age from Dr. Nolan's, Professor Nolan's prior study here, but we're going to look at a brand new piece of research using some of the most up-to-date equipment to measure macular pigment density from very recent piece of research on age-related decline of macular pigment. But just a quick aside on macular pigment before getting into the spatial profile and the central dip, we have to thank Richard Bone and John Landrum, professors at Florida International University, for all of their contributions to the research in macular pigments. I tend to stay in close contact with these two as well about updates in the research that they are currently performing. But looking back at some of their earliest research in macular carotenoids, 1985 was where they were able to identify and isolate lutein and zeaxanthine as the absolute two carotenoids that they were aware of at the time in the retina. And fast forward now to 1993, this is where they were first able to isolate and identify the third macular pigment component, and that's mesozeaxanthine. And what we found out was that it's actually 1/3 of the macular carotenoid makeup, so very significant portion, and that the physiologic ratio of macular carotenoids is actually a 1:1:1 ratio of LM and Z. And we were actually able to map the spatial profile at the time using what was just becoming available was the chiral chromatography that was able to look at the very minor difference between zeaxanthine and mesozeaxanthine, and the chiral just meaning handedness, so your two hands match up nicely, but yet they're not perfect mirror images of each other. So the lutein, mesozeaxanthine, and zeaxanthine, all chemically the same on paper, but in reality, in space, the way they orient is just slightly different, and they have different spectral absorbances and antioxidant properties as well. So the distribution of the stereoisomers has been mapped, and a pathway to account for the presence of the non-dietary component, mesozeaxanthine, is proposed. And so this was 1996 in Experimental Eye Research, another well-respected journal in our industry. So looking at the high-performance liquid chromatography chromatograms, we see in the most outer region about the macula, we see high lutein, very little zeaxanthine. We see more zeaxanthine in relation to lutein as we go closer to the center of the fovea. And right about the fovea, we actually see here now more zeaxanthine and very little lutein. Now, we need to run the chiral chromatography to separate out the total zeaxanthine isomers and look at just zeaxanthine and then the meso component. And so here we go. So in the outer, we see very little meso. In the medial, more mesozeaxanthine to zeaxanthine. And once we get to the inner eccentricity about the fovea, we see an equal ratio. And we imagine if we could get ever infinitesimally smaller sections of concentric rings to test, that we would see even more mesozeaxanthine than Z. And we'll explain even further why this makes sense that the central fovea wants mesozeaxanthine. And so this is a little bit easier form to look at the spatial profile, but the purple line here being total carotenoid content right at the 0 mark center epifoveally. And the farther you go out, you see a very sharp drop off, so your exponential curve here. And then the green line being the ratio of meso-Z to Z, and the blue line being ratio of lutein to total Z isomers. And so right at the center, we have the most of the zeaxanthines, and farther out we go, we see more lutein. So here's an easier yet way to look at it. So we have meso, zeaxanthine, lutein. The farther out we go, the more lutein we see. The farther in we go, the more mesozeaxanthine we see. And we're in a roughly 1-to-1 depending on the eccentricity that's being evaluated. So is it? Absolutely. And this was in the Review of Ophthalmology, written by Bone and Landrum and released March 2011. If anyone would like to read this study, we have copies available for distribution, so be happy to send this along. Please let me know. So looking at the work of Paul Bernstein from the Moran Eye Center in Salt Lake City, Utah, he essentially looked at the antioxidative capacity of macular pigment, and this was using spectroscopy and measuring light-induced singlet oxygen generation in retinal tissue. And looking at the capacity of macular pigments to quench RPE and choroid-generated singlet oxygen. And so the order of the ability to quench singlet oxygen by macular pigment actually was mesozeaxanthin, zeaxanthin, and then lutein. And so mesozeaxanthin is the strongest of the three macular pigments in terms of its antioxidant capacity. And when combined in a physiologic ratio of 1 to 1 to 1, we actually see a synergistic effect that in the same concentration, LM and Z all together do more than any of the components alone. Another study by Bernstein, this is earlier, also examined the two zeaxanthin isomers and looked at their antioxidant capacity and observed that mesozeaxanthin was the better antioxidant in the presence of the binding protein. So what about this binding protein? Backing up even further in Paul Bernstein's work, we see that it was recently shown that uptake and stabilization of zeaxanthin lutein likely mediated by xanthophyll binding proteins, and that this proves the presence of native xanthophyll binding protein, and the effect is more pronounced for mesozeaxanthin, suggesting a specific site of binding to the xanthophyll binding protein for this carotenoid. So that's a very big something as well, showing that, okay, we've just learned that mesozeaxanthin is very central to the macula, and that there's a binding protein that wants mesozeaxanthin, that mesozeaxanthin is the stronger antioxidant at the center of the fovea. This is important when you start adding all of these pieces together. So we have the idea now of the central dip. So this is the unique form of low macular pigment. And this is all going to make sense when we look at some of the earliest of the supplementation trials using just lutein and zeaxanthin and what happens when we begin adding mesozeaxanthin to the supplementation formulas used. So thinking back to that macular pigment spatial profile that we saw, this is basically just half of that. So looking at lopping the fovea right at the epicenter and looking one direction, this would be a normal spatial profile, and then here we see the atypical spatial profile or a central dip. And so instead of a nice mountaintop peak, we see more like a crater at the center, like a volcano, so a double peak. And so getting to the most recent study I'm talking about just a couple minutes ago, Clinical Ophthalmology 2013, association of age and macular pigment optical density using dual wavelength autofluorescence. So this is been the up and coming technology and probably to be the future of objective results, achieving a full spatial profile in seconds. And so what we're seeing here is that MPOD values highest near the foveal center, and that these increased through our childhood and adulthood, and then we see a reduction beyond roughly 50 years of age, but that reduction, so these curves are representing the reduction with age, but what we're seeing here is at 2 degrees eccentricity about the fovea, at 1 degree, and then the steepest drop-off with age is at the half degree eccentric. So this is where we find the most of the zeaxanthin, specifically the mesozeaxanthin isomers. So this is very important. This is where meso resides. This is where we're seeing the steepest drop-off. We know that the binding protein prefers the mesozeaxanthin, that is the stronger antioxidant. And so tied to all of the risk factors that we were just discussing, this is very important to make this connection. And so the supplementation trials that have been done, this was designed to investigate supplementation in patients that demonstrate this central dip, this atypical spatial profile. So this is what that looks like at half degree. This is where we see the dip start to kick in. And so why do we want to look at supplementation trials for patients with this central dip? Well, in a recent study at the Waterford Institute, at the Macular Pigment Research Group, they saw 12%, 58 subjects out of nearly 500 demonstrated this reproducible atypical spatial profile, and it was persistent. Also, so lutein and zeaxanthin, sure, we've proved that they work, but not for everybody. That in some of the early research, even 2007, we saw lutein, zeaxanthin, and antioxidants, probably the mistake, working quite well, in fact. We actually saw fairly good results for the most part, but, quote from the study, there remains a substantial proportion of subjects for whom, in spite of rises in serum concentrations of LMZ, meaning they're taking up these products into their blood serum, that macular pigment density did not increase. So lutein and zeaxanthin were doing nothing for these individuals in terms of increasing their macular pigment density. So these are these persistent central dips. And so that's why this study was performed. Group 1 looking at high-dose lutein, 20 milligrams, 2 milligrams of zeaxanthin. Group 2 received the 10-10-2 formulation, which this is going to become very important in a moment. 10 milligrams of Meso-Z, 10 of lutein, and 2 of zeaxanthin. So total of 22 milligrams of zeaxanthin isomers and 10 of lutein. And group 3 that actually received a very high dose of meso-zeaxanthin. People said, well, if meso's good, isn't more better? And so we gave them 17 of meso, 3 of lutein, 2 of zeaxanthin. And we looked at macular pigment at multiple eccentricities about the fovea: quarter degree, half degree, 1, 175, and 3. So here's what happened with our group 1. And we actually saw in 8 weeks' time, no statistically significant increase in macular pigment at any eccentricity that was taking just lutein zeaxanthin alone, folks with the central dip or an atypical spatial profile. So group 3, looking at the high meso formulation, we actually saw at 8 weeks very rapid repair of this central dip, but nothing else happened. When we include meso-zeaxanthin in the proper ratio of 10-10-2, we actually see a very quick repair, 8 weeks, of the central dip, but we also see significant rise at other eccentricities and trends towards increase in macular pigments at the most. I'm going to do that one again. So for group 2, which was supplemented with the 10-10-2 formulation, we actually saw very quick repair of the central dip. So we now see a normal spatial profile within 2 months, and we see significant rise at further eccentricities, and we see trends towards increases beyond half degree. So 10-10-2, rapid repair of the central dip and increase across the spatial profile. So more is not always better. It's taking the 3 in a combination that is the correct ratio. And so here they are, group 1, 2, the high meso group. Group 3, a balance, 10-10-2, 22 milligrams of total zeaxanthin isomers, 10 of lutein, and of those zeaxanthin isomers, 10 milligrams are going to be meso-zeaxanthin. And so just getting quickly to why macular pigments are important in terms of visual performance beyond risk reduction, because now we can talk about a whole nother subset of patients where AREDS is only for your category 3 and 4. In fact, they say don't give it to everybody else in the earlier stages of the disease because A, it's not proven to work, and B, there's higher risk of side effects the longer that individuals are on AREDS formulation. But now we've opened this up to all of your category 1 and category 2, which is 80% of people with the disease, and folks that actually have normal, healthy eyes, but possibly low macular pigment. They're complaining about glare or difficulties in nighttime driving, or they're enthusiasts for sport. You're big-time tennis players, golfers, baseball players. And so looking at chromatic aberration, the idea is that we want to focus the green light, the peak of our spectral sensitivity, right at the fovea. And that the red naturally is going to focus just a little bit past that, but that's okay because it's about a quarter of a diopter off. But the blue light, however, is going to focus much earlier than your green light before it hits the fovea, and having no blue cone receptors right at the foveola, this blue light is actually deleterious to our best visual performance. And so that creates this blur zone, this chromatic aberration. And so defocused blue light on the retina, degrading image quality and motion tracking. So influence of dietary carotenoids. This was actually a study on lutein and zeaxanthin visual performance in relation to specifically baseball players. And so I'd be happy to send this study along because we're going to breeze through a lot of these studies here since they can get a little bit lengthy, but I have all of these for anybody that's interested in any further reading on visual performance related to macular pigments. And so the reason is lateral chromatic aberration. So looking at the peak of our spectral sensitivity, around 550 nanometers, going towards the reds, we see very little shift, very little aberration of light through an optical media. But from the peak of our spectral sensitivity down to basically UV here at 400, we see a huge drop-off, nearly an exponential drop-off in chromatic aberration. So we have a total of over 2 diopters of shift between blues and reds, and most of that happens underneath where we are spectrally tuned in the greens. So we have this short wavelength defocus blurring the image at the fovea. So the idea is that more macular pigment is going to filter away the harmful effects of the blue light at the fovea, hence helping us see better. So the evidence supporting macular pigment enhancement for optimization of visual performance, this is a study from 2013, Lisa Renzi, and this is the Department of Psychology. This is Billy Hammond in Georgia. So very good research there. Basically for even younger groups of individuals, macular pigment optical density was related to variable position reaction time as well as coincidence anticipation errors at high speed. So this is basically saying we're going to help people's reaction time the higher we can get their macular pigment density. So glare disability, photostress recovery, contrast, chromatic contrast in relation to macular pigment and serum lutein zeaxanthin. These results confirm early reports of a significant relationship between variations in macular pigment optical density and immediate effects on visual function. So macular pigment and its contributions to vision, macular pigment's prereceptoral absorption of blue light, consequential attenuation of the effects. Basically, the more lutein, zeaxanthin, and meso-Z we have, the more we're going to enhance visual performance in diseased and non-diseased eyes alike. And then another from 2010, the influence of dietary lutein and zeaxanthin on visual performance, same connection. There's a lot of these studies, and these are all from fantastic journals from our field. So I'm not going to take a lot of time delving into the details, but you can see what I've highlighted here. You're welcome to review this presentation later, hit pause, read through these, email me, request the study. I'd be happy to send this along. This is some very neat information. The glare hypothesis of macular pigment function. This is a really good one. Influence of filtering by macular carotenoids and contrast sensitivity measured under simulated blue haze conditions. So this is all those people that hate the blue headlights, the xenon headlamps, and the LEDs on all the new cars. How do we help them see better? It's going to be through enhancing macular pigment density across their spatial profile, and that includes meso-zeaxanthin in the formula. macular pigment and visual performance and glare. Benefits for photostress recovery time, glare disability, visual discomfort, so how to make vision more comfortable, especially in very bright environments. It's going to be through macular pigments. So again, email me for the studies. I'll send you this whole portion of the slide deck if you wish. The effect of macular pigment on heterochromatic luminance contrast. So our data suggests MP modifies an object's contrast against a shortwave background via simple filtration. So baseball on a blue sky. Very, very straightforward, but this is going to help individuals see better. Impact of macular pigment augmentation on visual performance using different carotenoid formulations. Again, so we looked at this study earlier, and basically the 10-10-2 formulation wins every time. And then preservation of visual sensitivity of older subjects, association with pigment density. So for older subjects that had higher macular pigment density, they didn't have the types of losses that we associate with older patients' vision. They had vision more like that of younger subjects. But those with low macular pigment density had lower sensitivity for contrast than their younger counterparts. So although they note this study doesn't prove the causality, the results show that high macular pigment density is absolutely associated with retention of youthful vision sensitivity. So very, very straightforward. So who do you want to give macular pigments to? I mean, who are we going to advise and prescribe a regimen, a treatment for macular pigment? So any patients with the risk factors that we've covered. Family history, over 55, smokers, light iris. Anybody who comes into your office and complains about glare, especially nighttime driving, or sports enthusiasts. These are people that spend thousands of dollars on new golf clubs. And does it really improve their game? Possibly, it might. But this is a new edge. This is something else that you can offer them. Be their hero for their game. So it takes all three. That's LMC. And I want to thank you. And any email requests will be answered. Happy to send along the abstracts or the full studies. Please contact me. Hope everyone has a great day.